Hello and welcome. Well, salt, as a natural resource, it's found everywhere from our tears, our perspiration to the ocean. Now, would you believe the earliest evidence of humans producing salt date back to 6000 BC in northern China? So it's been part of our lives for thousands of years. But much like sugar, salt is hidden in so many of our everyday foods. Without knowing it, three-quarters of the salt that we eat is already in the everyday foods that we have, such as bread, breakfast cereal, and ready meals. So, for this reason, it's very easy for us to exceed our daily intake without knowing it. So, for better health, we really need to limit our daily intake to the recommended amount because, as we know, the side effects of too much salt are detrimental to adults. But we also need to take into consideration the impacts it has for children and for babies. So, to help talk to us about this today and to help give her expert information and advice on some tasty and healthy salt alternatives, we welcome back our special guest, Siobhan Boyle, CEO of Jamie Oliver's The Good Foundation. Thank you for joining us today, Siobhan, and welcome back. How are you?
I'm really good, thank you. How are you?
Well, really excited to be talking on this topic. And as mentioned before, it is astonishing how much salt is hidden in our everyday foods. Now, before we get into this, 'cause there's so much that I want to ask you about this, I just wanted to acknowledge we published your article titled Salt Alternatives. So, for anyone that hasn't read your article yet, please tell us what it's about and, of course, what inspired you to write it.
Yeah, absolutely. As you said, salt is a hot topic. I mean, probably just underneath the sugar topic at the moment. But it's an article about the alternatives to salt. Now, we do actually need an element of salt in our diets because our bodies can't function without it. However, anything in excess is no good for our bodies, and it's just about the potential risks associated with eating too much salt. Um, and then just making you aware of those ingredients that you do cook with, which already contain salt, like anchovies or Parmesan cheese, and soy sauce, which are ingredients that we use on quite frequently, and we'll add that sort of salty element to your dishes. So what it's doing is we're trying to teach you about how to recognize when you're already adding a salty ingredient in, taste your food, and don't add extra salt if you don't need it. And also using all of those beautiful fresh herbs and spices to pack flavor into your food without reaching for that salt pot. So it's just about sort of, I suppose, training your mind and giving you that little education piece so that when you do cook, you are sort of tasting and using sort of a variety of ingredients to create flavor rather than just using salt for that.
Yeah, so I mean, as we know, it enhances flavors in our foods, but like many things, too much of it isn't great for our health, especially for our children and, of course, for babies. So, just in your opinion, just initially, I mean, how important do you think it is maybe for parents to reduce their salt intake in their household diets and home cooked meals just to the recommended amount? What's your thoughts?
Well, I think probably the most important thing is cooking from scratch. So, if you're, as you rightly said in the introduction, a lot of salt is hidden in processed food and ready meals, and that's what gives it their flavor. So, they pack them, full of flavor by packing them full of sugar and salt. So, if you're cooking from scratch and you're using fresh ingredients, you're going a long, long way into reducing, and you'll be amazed, into reducing your overall salt intake. I mean, it's quite astounding if you start to look at the back of ingredients of ready meals or packaged food, and you look at, basically the largest ingredient is the first one on the ingredients list. So you pick up a jar of sauce and you're like, oh my goodness, that sugar, that salt, and then you're like, that's what I'm paying for, and that's what's giving it all the flavor. So that kind of gives you, an understanding of that degree of and that level of salt which is in the which is already in those foods. So when you are cooking from scratch, you then have total control over what you're putting in, and it's so important because your taste buds change as well because they get so used to having salty ingredients. So if you're always eating a lot of processed food, and that's what your kids are used to as well, then their taste buds are used to having a certain level of salt in their diet, and so then it's quite hard to sort of change those habits. So, if you can get them used to those fresh ingredients, like using citrus and herbs as well, to kind of give you those flavors, instead of that saltiness, you're instilling those really sort of positive habits, not only for their diet, but for their taste buds too. So it's a good training to get into for yourself and for your family. So it not only just for the flavor side of things and being more confident at playing with flavors, but also from the health benefits that you'll get long term too.
Mm. So I guess the question really remains, I mean, how much salt is the right amount? Like we know that our bodies need it in small amounts. It's sort of helps us from a healthy perspective balance our blood pressure and all of those types of things. But I did a little bit of research earlier. Now, so for adults, I believe the recommended amount is less than 5 grams a day. So that's equivalent to about 1 teaspoon of salt, which isn't a great amount. Babies and children under 11 years of age should have less salt than adults, of course. And of course, just to acknowledge that we should never add salt to our baby's milk or food, and don't give food that is in particular sort of very high in salt. And of course, if a baby is being breastfed, ensuring that they're getting the right amount of salt. They generally get that from the breast milk from the mother. So formula contains a similar amount found in the breast milk. But there's a myth, of course, that says that we should know that salt that foods are salty just by tasting them. But that's not always the case, is it? It's true that some foods that are high in salt won't necessarily taste salty at all. I'd love to know what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah, and that's the thing, because when salt is being used to bring out the flavor, because that's what it does, it's a
Yeah.
flavor enhancer. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get the flavor of salt. It means it's going to sort of bring out the flavors of those ingredients you cook with. And I mean, salt's pretty amazing when you are cooking. It does it if you're when you're sauteing onions, it brings out the water and it cooks them more quickly. And so and it brings out the water because it dehydrates. And that's also what it's doing to your body. So it kind of, you can see what it's doing to the food. You can see what it's doing to your body at the same time. But you don't necessarily get the flavor of salt. You'll get a richer flavor of the ingredient. So it can be quite, I suppose, disconcerting, because you're thinking, well, that doesn't taste salty to me. I'm going to add some malt salt in because people like the flavor of salt. Whereas if you eat something like a hot chip or a packet of chips and you know that they've got salt on them, and that's what you're getting that flavor and that hit of salt. And so that's what people associate with certain foods, and certain foods that they think are particularly delicious as well, because everyone does love a hot chip, don't they? And everyone loves something. They're sometimes foods, but they do appreciate those flavors. And so it is it is kind of confusing, isn't it, when you're like,
Yeah.
well, it doesn't taste salty to me, and I haven't. Or if you added in a salty ingredient like some soy sauce or some bacon, you haven't really thought about the fact that you've already put some salt in there,
Yeah.
and you're like, well, it tastes like bacon, it doesn't taste salty. So it's, yeah. And and then people will naturally, and I know, I don't know necessarily whether it's our generation, but I think my parents' generation, they definitely would they'd reach for the salt at the table. So instead of tasting
Yes.
their food, um they will just naturally go and they'll pop something on top of their food and some extra salt, and you'll be like, well, have you tasted it first? Because you don't know whether it's going to need it. But that there is that sort of automatic sort of habit that people are in. And it's the same when you are when you're cooking too. There's a lot of people who don't taste their food when they're cooking, and so they don't know what levels of salt to put in. And when you're cooking something, you might not actually need to add anything, but equally it can be quite flavorless if you don't add anything. So there's that, it's getting that balance right. And if you are cooking from scratch, it's being aware of those ingredients that you might be putting in, which already have that level of salt in there, and then getting used to sort of how things should taste and getting used to having that balance as well. So this is it's a great, I mean, it's a great tool in the kitchen. We can't take it away, but we just need to limit how much we put in. And the best way to do that is by cooking from scratch.
Yes. And I mean, I just wanted to acknowledge what you're saying before about different nutritional labels and those types of things. Of course, the content can vary widely between different brands and varieties. So it is very important for us to be able to take note of that, and just the time, and understanding if there's a particular label or brand that we do follow and that we do like, if there is maybe a better alternative, always just to be aware of it. But the foods that we can get caught out on, as you mentioned earlier, things like breads, there's things, even crumpets. I couldn't believe that crumpets are high in salt, but that's true. Bagels and ciabattas, different pasta sauces, as you mentioned earlier, chips, pizza, any ready meals, canned soup, I believe, is a really high one, for salt. Sausages, tomato sauce and mayonnaise, lots of different sauces that we sort of put on things as well, I believe, is high in salt. And breakfast cereals. Is there any that I've missed at all?
And
Um,
actually, something which is a cupboard staple, and we encourage you to use in our courses and when we're teaching people to cook, are like canned pulses, and also tin tomatoes. So there's a huge variance in the quality of tin tomatoes, and often tin tomatoes will have a level of salt in them. And so it's always good to read the label. So, one of the tips we give
yep.
to people is always read the label. And, you don't want to look like a total nutter when you're walking around the supermarket, but it's really interesting when you start to compare brands and you're like, oh my goodness, I thought that was good for me. And then you're kind of going, oh my gosh, what have they put into it? They've got loads of added salt in there. And it's the same with your canned beans and pulses. Often the solution that they're stored in is a saline solution, so it's salty as well. So it's really, you always need to rinse your pulses when you're putting them into a dish, because otherwise you're adding like salty water into what could already be quite a salty tomato sauce. So it is, getting yourself to know your ingredients, know what you're buying, read the labels, and that will give you sort of a huge education piece. Sometimes it's a bit of a shock because it's the brands that you think are going to be amazing actually are packed full of salt. So it is, this is one of the things we teach people, and on a jar it will also say the level per 100 grams. So you can, which can be quite confusing as well, because if you're only using, say, a teaspoon of mustard, it's not going to be huge. It might be huge per 100 grams, but you're never going to use 100 grams worth of mustard in a dish. So
Mm.
it's all relative to kind of the levels you're using as well.
Of course. And I just wanted to acknowledge the foods that are high in salt, the ones that we already know about. I just wanted to acknowledge, for us to cut down on salt and to eat them less and less often, and to have smaller amounts of things, of course, like anchovies, that's my favorite, bacon, of course, cheese, gravy as well, ham, olives, pickles, seafood like prawns, salami, of course, salted and dry roasted nuts, salty fish, of course, soy sauce, stock cubes, which I found interesting, but that would make sense, as you mentioned earlier, as a flavor enhancer, and yeast extract. So there's lots of things that we can actually do, and we can still have them, but in smaller amounts. But I'd love to know from your perspective, why is too much salt bad for both adults and children's diets?
So, as I mentioned earlier, what salt does, it dehydrates you. So and that's sort of, we're not going to get too scientific because otherwise people will start to nod off. I should think if I get too scientific. But what we don't want is, we don't want to be dehydrated. Our bodies are predominantly made up of water, and so if you're having anything that's going to dehydrate you, obviously that's going to sort of affect the balance of your body and your balance of your blood. So you don't want to do that. But not only is it dehydrating, which then puts pressure onto your organs, and that's not a good thing, but it also puts pressure on one of your major organs, your heart, and
Mm.
it's one of the biggest risk factors in heart disease and heart attacks. So, you're set, basically, it's one of those things where, an excess of salt, really is one of the highest risk factors. And so having that control and knowing what's in your food is so important, so that then you can sort of be, everything you're feeding yourself is nourishing your body, and you're not putting yourself at potential risk. And we're not neither of us are saying don't eat salt, because that's not possible, and actually that's dangerous too on the other extreme. But it's just being very aware of what you're cooking with, if you are using those salty ingredients, don't add extra salt in. And if you are using a ready because everyone needs a little element of convenience in their lives, but if you are reaching for a convenience product, make sure that you read the labels and buy the best possible one that you
Yeah.
can. So it's just making yourself aware and being sort of an educated shopper, an educated cook. And and basically, if you're cooking from scratch, you should be limiting, you are already limiting the amount of salt you're putting in your food because you have total control.
Yep. And it can like creep up on us, and if we're not drinking enough water also. So, too much salt, as you just mentioned, can contribute to things like high blood pressure, heart problems and heart failure, kidney problems, including kidney stones, very painful, as people would know, fluid retention, stroke, and osteoporosis. So all of these things, of course. Sorry, my microphone was going a bit funny there, so I might have to just edit that bit out. Hang on just for a moment. I have to just redo that. Sorry. It's getting to that time of the day. The internet's getting a bit glitchy. Sorry.
It's Friday afternoon.
It's going to.
Is it 1 o'clock yet?
Oh, so I'll just redo that bit again. I don't even know what I was saying. What did I say going into that? Sorry. I said something like, what, do you remember what I was saying?
Oh gosh, no, I've gone off on a tangent.
What did I say?
I'm just trying to think, what were you saying?
It's okay. I'll edit it around. I'll just say this bit again. I'll edit it. Here we go. 5, 4, 3, too much. Hang on. 1, 2, 3. We've got some storms outside at the moment, so I'm just being cautious of maybe that's why it's been a bit glitchy. Here we go. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So too much salt can contribute to things like high blood pressure, heart failure, kidney problems, including kidney stones. And as we know, they can be extremely painful, fluid retention, stroke, and osteoporosis. So all of these things we just have to be, I think, mindful of. But I'd love to know also, in your opinion, and you did mention earlier, do you think that once a child's palate has developed a taste for salty food, that they would be much more likely to eat food and want that type of salty food later on in their life and definitely into adulthood?
Yeah, 100%. But I do think that you can change that. It's like with anything, habits can be formed, but habits can be broken. So, if you are sort of taking control and go, right, we're gonna make some small positive changes, you don't you don't change everything overnight. And this is the I think what a lot of the problems people have when they are they have the perception of healthy eating. They think they've got to go from eating takeaway and junk food to eating just salads and in their mind non-delicious
Yes.
food,
Yeah.
which it isn't. And basically, fundamentally, the food is going to taste like cardboard to them because they've gone from eating very and this is what Jamie said. It's kind of you've gone from having these flavor enhanced ingredients, so you're used to lots and lots of flavors happening with your ready meals and your junk food, and then if you pull it back down to kind of you're not using those flavorful ingredients, then you're of course not going to enjoy that, and that you're going to revert back to your old ways. Whereas if you make small positive changes and you make little shifts and you're very aware of what you're putting in your food and putting into then you can sort of gradually train yourself into like really kind of appreciating, okay, well, I'm loving the flavor of those fresh herbs in this sauce, and that's giving that the flavor. So when you make a fresh pesto, and when you make a pesto from scratch, you pack it full of basil, and if you like using a full flavored cheese like a parmesan, you don't need to add any salt in because you need to add a minimal amount of salt because you've got basil, you've got your garlic, you've got olive oil, you've got lemon juice. So all of those things, which are great salt alternatives, and you're adding a little bit of full flavored salty cheese in there, gives you that amazing flavor. But you've made that from scratch. Whereas if you bought that out of a jar, you'd then be having, the salt levels would be much higher. And so it is those little changes you can do cooking from scratch, and then sort of making sure that you are very aware if the ingredient's salty, don't use as much of it. And if you are using if you are using a jarred sauce or something like that, making sure it's the best one you can buy. So it's just it is those habits that your family can sort of grow together. And and when you go on this cooking journey and when you get inspired by cooking from scratch, you do end up using more fresh ingredients. So you do, I don't know about you, but I use a lot of citrus. I use, lots of things that give food flavor, like the garlics and the chili and the ginger and things that give you those flavor punches, which means that you're not having to sort of add in a ton of salt as well. So it's just being very clever with the way you do things, but just ensuring that you're training your palate along the way so that you actually enjoy what you're eating, because food's a pleasure, isn't it? I know it is for me, and I know it is for you. So it should be something that you and your family really love and enjoy. And you don't want meal times to become a battleground and people going, well, that's yucky, because that's no fun either. And then that goes into that's a whole different problem of food waste and children becoming picky eaters. So empowering yourself, empowering your family to cook from scratch, and to make those sort of flavorful foods, but using those salt alternatives in your everyday cooking is a great way to start.
And just being mindful, I think of that also, just not just going to salt as thinking that's going to fix every meal. So with that,
Yeah.
you've mentioned some of the easy alternatives to ensure that the meal still tastes delicious. Is there any others in particular? And you've also spoken a lot about herbs that you use to make like sort of the meals taste a lot sort of tasteful as well. Is there anything else that maybe you could maybe add to those lists at all?
So I mean, my spice rack is always full of lots of spices. I tend to grind them up in my mortar and pestle. So having those lots of aromatics, like sort of your cumins and your coriander and like chili flakes, will sort of take your dishes to those next levels. And I always have parsley. I always have rosemary, especially in winter, because that's nice and robust. Also, I seem to be able to keep it alive on the balcony. And I always have basil as well. And then in terms of citrus, I've always got lime, I've always got lemons, and I've always got some like an orangey thing to add to fruits, or to add to which and also delicious to add into salads too. So you've got those sort of flavors and that range of ingredients, which I would say are my go-tos. And in terms of recipes, it's just being very mindful when you are cooking the recipes which have salty ingredients. I mean, Jamie's got some great recipes you wouldn't even need to add any salt into, like his classic Caesar salad recipe. He's got some delicious ragouts and lasagnas which have bacon in the base. And so, every time I suppose it's training your brain as well. So every time you're cooking, you're thinking about what you're putting in and being very mindful about what's going into your dishes, so that everything is well thought out, and then you don't get a shock at the end going, oh my goodness, well, actually I've put in ginger, and I put in chili, and I put in this, and then I've put in some salt, and then I put in some parmesan. You're going, oh my gosh, I put in layer upon layer upon layer of salt, which is not ideal. So but but you want your food to taste delicious. So it's just making sure that you're making the best of your ingredients, and making sure that they're flavorsome and nutritious as well.
Which is all you teach all of these things in your courses also, don't you, as well? Could you maybe tell us a little bit more about that, and how parents ultimately, and children, of course, can learn how to do this themselves?
Yeah, we've got two programs that we run, and we have our Learn Your Fruit and Veg program, where we go into preschools and primary schools and daycare centres, and we teach kids about different fruits and vegetables. So take them on a bit of a journey from seed to plant to plate, and we get them tasting like seasonal ingredients. And then we get them making a non-heat recipe together. So part of that is, getting them to eat a tomato in its raw state, and the different colors of tomatoes. And so we inspire them from a really young age to get used to tasting and smelling ingredients, so they really appreciate why things taste good. And it's the same in our adult program. It's every week features a new recipe. We take them through a different range of cooking skills, so they get exposed to different seasonal recipes, different kitchen skills as well, and different nutrition tips, so that every week we are teaching them and empowering them how to cook from scratch. And one of the things we do is we compare a processed version to a cooked to your homemade version. We say, well, look, you've put 5 ingredients in this pasta sauce. and you've got total control over what's gone into that. And this is what's in your jarred sauce, and they look at the list of ingredients, and it's about 14 ingredients, including a lot of salt and
I was
salt,
just gonna say
sort
that.
of, and also salt can come in hidden names as well. When you, and especially sort of, you've got MSG, which is another salty ingredient, which is which you get in quite a lot of Asian sauces. So that's one to look out for as well. So it's it's a bit like sugar. Sugar can be hidden in lots of different ways. Um, yeah, in our programs, this is something we teach people about because we want them to have those skills. So it's not just about the learning to cook; it's knowing how to shop. It's knowing what to look for and recognizing seasonal ingredients. And eating seasonally is one of the probably the most important things we teach people, because what we're looking for is flavor, and we're looking for value. And we know that if you eat seasonally, you're going to eat it, and it's going to taste blooming delicious. It's going to be better value for you, and it's going to it's going to enhance your dishes, so it's going to taste as good as it possibly can do, and you probably don't need to add anything else. And we were talking just before we came on air about the wonderful thing about eating good quality ingredients, and actually you don't need to do too much to them, do you? Because they taste fabulous. So it is about and that's the exciting thing about when you do eat seasonally. You've got that capacity to kind of eat differently throughout the year and get the best of the produce throughout the year, and you won't need to add all of those little extras in, because the ingredients speak for themselves.
Well said. Well said. Well, I guess the bottom line is that salt overall, and as you mentioned earlier, is still an important part of our diet and does play an essential role in our body. So we do need a little bit of it, and keeping to the recommended daily amounts. But like many things and everything in life, everything's in moderation. So I guess for anyone watching and listening, how would you summarize your key messages today?
Um, what I'd like to say is that salt isn't bad for you, but too much salt, like anything, can be very dangerous. So it's getting that balance right, understanding your ingredients, understanding what you're cooking with, and appreciating those alternatives to really pack your foods full of flavor. So don't forget the value of having a well-stocked spice shelf. There's fresh herbs as well, and citrus, which are just going to sort of lift your dishes and enhance them, and give you those flavor punches that you're looking for, which you may have alternatively found from salt. But the most important thing is cook from scratch, and you are going to be then in total control over what you're putting in your food. So as always, that's what we can't stress how important it is to get people back in the kitchen, inspiring them to cook with healthy ingredients from scratch. And you are then going to be sort of going a long way in improving your health long term. And then especially with this salt topic, you will then have total control about that level of salt you put into your dishes.
That's wonderful. And in the article, of course, you've given us some links to some of Jamie's and some of your fantastic recipes as well. So we'll have that in the show notes. And of course, if anyone's got any questions or would like to know any more about your programs and the Good Foundation, whereabouts can they find you guys?
If you go to thegoodfoundation.com.au, that's got a big overview of what we do, how many people we've reached, the programs that we teach, and an availability to sign up to the programs as a participant. But also, we're always looking for people to collaborate, partner with, to help us continue on our vision and mission to transform the eating habits of Australian communities. So we would love to hear from you, and we want every single Australian to be cooking from scratch. That's ultimately, we want to do ourselves out of a job. So come and join us on our mission, and we've got a long way to go yet. So, we love the fact that we can inspire people to get back into the kitchen, and that's what it's all about.
Perfect. And we'll have all of those links, that information in the show notes. Thanks again for your time, Siobhan. As always, love chatting with you, and take care, and we'll speak to you again soon. But stay safe in the meantime. Take care.
Thank you very much. Bye.
All right, bye.